Hello everybody, welcome to our Introduction to Gender Studies course. This is lecture number 1, not on your end, but this is take 25 or so. Hopefully it works this time, and I'm looking forward to hearing your comments and questions. The first thing I'm going to do is get myself out of the way so that you can see the slides. Okay, so one of the problems I was having was getting the poll to work with the video. So I've given up on that, and what I'm going to do instead is just ask you these questions. You will see them in a poll quiz type thing underneath the lecture. Are you a feminist? Why or why not? Think about it. And the second question I'm asking is, do you believe in equality for everyone, regardless of gender or sex? The definition of feminism is the belief in equality for everyone of all genders and all sexes. So if you don't consider yourself a feminist and yet you believe in the principle that is the definition of feminism, the question becomes, what's the problem with the word feminist? As you watch these slides, note your positive or negative reactions to any of the things that I say or the images that I present. And I'd like you to pick 3 in particular and note your reactions. For example, the next slide is going to be the Shirley Chisholm slide. Do you feel positive about seeing Shirley Chisholm, one of the first Black representatives in Congress? Or do you feel negative because the slide seems dated and not relevant to today? Okay, and there she is, Shirley Chisholm. What is feminism? The definitions posted here are the ones that people understand. Feminism specifically being a theory and a set of beliefs that challenge gender-based inequalities. All genders, all sexes should be equal, treated equally, seen equally, and until we have that kind of equality, feminism is still a principle that is contested and questioned, and for many people who believe in this kind of equality but don't want to call themselves feminists, problematic. So, key concepts in feminist theory and practice. The idea of striving for equal rights and opportunities for all genders and people of all sexes. Not both, notice, but all. That in itself is a problematic statement for people who think that there are only 2 sexes and 2 genders. Note that the idea of all sexes and all genders goes against the gender binary, which is the idea that there are only 2 sexes and 2 genders. Other key concepts and terms that we'll be using this semester include patriarchy, intersectionality. The intersections are meeting of different theories and practices. For example, as it says here, the intersectionality of feminism and other ideologies like liberalism, feminism and conservatism, feminism and Marxism, or environmentalism. So those intersections, those meetings of different theories are something that we will talk about a lot. And of course, the gender binary, stereotypes. There is a list under the definitions tab in our course. I strongly suggest that you look at those definitions. There's a set of fundamental words and other concepts that are not as widely used. I encourage you to start using the vocabulary of this discipline as you write and talk and post your discussions. So the word feminism was coined by a Frenchman named Charles Fourier. He obviously was writing in French. There's a French school of feminist thought and American British school of feminist thought that meet at some points and diverge at other points. But Fourier is the one who first used the word feminism in French, which I'm not going to attempt. And the word feminist appeared in the Oxford English Dictionary, which is the unabridged dictionary of all English terms, about 25 years after Fourier first developed it. It appeared in English in 1852, and since that time, feminism as a movement has spread across the world in many different forms. And I want you to note that date, 1852, because we're going to talk about the grandmothers of feminist thought, who were feminist before feminism was a word, and some of them suffered greatly. This image does not come from the mid-19th century. It's an image from the 60s, but you'll see it a lot, or I've seen it a lot, in people's presentations on feminism. So I thought I would include it here as you look at that. What is your reaction? How do you feel about it? Is it dated? Is it too, strident for you? Is it not strident enough? Just note how you're reacting. So these concepts are the ones that are highlighted in our learning management system under the definitions tab. It's definitions and course information, but the words that I would like you to start using specifically are feminism, patriarchy, gender, sexuality. I want you to understand that gender and sex are not the same thing. The intersectionalities of many different forms of thought are part and parcel of our course and of any course of study within this discipline. And the other words here, I've defined them all for you elsewhere. But I just want to highlight the fact that words matter. And when you see the word patriarchy or the word feminism, you need to know that you have suddenly entered into a discussion or discourse within the discipline of gender and women's studies. In addition, when you are making a point or developing an argument within the discipline, it's a very good idea to use the vocabulary of that discipline to establish your knowledge or authority as you make your case. So the grandmothers of the feminist movement are considered to be people like Mary Wollstonecraft, who wrote Vindication of the Rights of Women. She was an outspoken writer. She pushed the idea that women should be educated like men, treated like men, and given the same economic benefits as men had. She never married. She was considered to be a quote-unquote loose woman in the 1700s because she had children but didn't think that marriage was something that she really wanted to do. She died in childbirth 9 days after giving birth to Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein. And that's another whole story about that. Mary Shelley was one of the first women to write science fiction. And the reason for that is partly because her mother died giving birth to her. So Mary Wollstonecraft is one of the outspoken grandmothers of the feminist movement. Abigail Adams, the wife of the second president of the United States, is another woman who in the 1700s begged her husband to give women the same rights as men in this new country that they were developing. And of course, her husband was not having any of it, which is unfortunate. That the whole course of history could have been changed if John Adams and some others had decided to take a stand on women's rights, to take a stand against slavery, but they didn't. And the history of our country continues to reflect those problems. So the women of New Jersey had the right to vote until the 1790s, at which time they gave that right up until 1920, when the Women's Suffrage Amendment was passed. Thomas Paine is another feminist. He believed in the emancipation of women. He wrote about it. He was very outspoken about it. It's not one of the things that he's known for, interestingly, but he is definitely would qualify as a feminist under our definitions. And Eliza Hamilton, the wife of Alexander Hamilton, I put her in with a question mark because there's not enough history to determine whether or not she was, in fact, a feminist. She did a lot of public things. She raised money to create the Washington Memorial. She founded and ran the first orphanage in New York City, which still exists. So she did a lot of public things, but because there's not a lot of history about her and people didn't bother to study her very much, the question of whether she was actually a feminist or whether she was a woman of privilege doing things with the money that she had is something that is still a question. In fact, an interesting final project might be for someone to do a project on whether actually Elizabeth Schuyler Hamilton, was a feminist or not. There are 4 waves of feminism. The first 3 are historical, and the 4th is the one we are in currently. The first wave of feminism took place in the mid-19th to early 20th century. The Seneca Falls Convention of 1848 started the push for women to get the right to vote. At the same time, Black men and Black women were also looking for the right to vote. So suffragist Frederick Douglass was part of the Seneca Falls Convention, where people were looking to get the right to vote, the ones who were disenfranchised, who did not have the right to have a say in our democracy. The names here are the names of known feminists who were known at the time and who attended the convention of 1848. Some people called it a mob. Other people called it a forward-looking meeting. But in any case, you can see from this graphic over to the right that while the ideas of feminism started in the mid-19th century, it took until the late 19th century for the United Kingdom to grant women the right to vote, and it took until 1/4 of the way, almost through the 20th century, for American women to get that same right to vote. It took a lot longer for women to make other strides in terms of getting credit, being able to buy a house, being able to get jobs that paid as much as men. In fact, that fight, the fight for equality of pay, is still going on. So the first wave started in the 19th century. The second wave went from the 1960s to the 1980s, and some of the people that are in these images are people who fought for abortion. You'll see that the abortion issue is a huge issue, and another possible final project could be why that particular issue continues to this day to be a question and a problem, looking at both sides of the issue and seeing who is a proponent of bodily autonomy and who is not, and why, is a very, very interesting and problematic question. So while we see in the second wave images a lot of the questions of election and abortion in the 1960s, safe and legal abortions now, you see a lot of pictures of a clothes hanger. And why the clothes hanger? People hang themselves? No. The way women would give themselves abortions before abortion became safe and legal was to use a clothes hanger to pull the fetus out from themselves. And often they would die in the process or after of infections. And so the idea that a woman did not want to bring another being into the world for whatever her personal reason was led many, many women to die of self-inflicted abortions. The time for equality is now this middle picture here. That kind of equality is still being sought. In the 1950s and 60s, women could not own credit on their own in the United States. So an author like the author of Little House on the Prairie, Laura Ingalls Wilder, whose franchise made a lot of money, could not get a mortgage in her own name in the 1950s. When Laura Ingalls Wilder was born, she didn't have the right to vote. She finally got the right to vote, but she wasn't able to buy a house with a mortgage. So the kind of equality that people were looking for in the 1960s was achieved by the 1980s to some extent, though women were still not making as much as their male counterparts. Even in the 1990s, women were not still making as much as their male counterparts, as witnessed by Lilly Ledbetter, who trained males to do the job that she was doing for years and saw them move ahead of her, and she never was compensated what she was worth, certainly, and she sued to get equal compensation and lost, but the Lilly Ledbetter Act has her name on it as a memorial to the fact that she was the one who started another significant fight in equality. This picture with the red background shows Betty Friedan and others. The idea of the nasty woman down there in the corner of that little image is something that was revisited after Trump was elected. He called Hillary Clinton a nasty woman, and in 2016, they took up that again, though it had been around since the 1970s. The top picture there shows Betty Friedan, Shirley Chisholm, Gloria Steinem. We see Gloria Steinem again in the bottom picture here. Gloria Steinem was an outspoken feminist who founded Ms. Magazine, a journal that is still in publication. And I added this picture here to the right. Women's liberation is a lesbian plot. This is a facetious statement. It is something that they were touting in the 1960s. All feminists are lesbians, all lesbians are feminists. And of course, in the 1960s, if one was a lesbian, one was also considered mentally ill. Thank you, Sigmund Freud. It wasn't until 1980 that homosexuality as a mental illness was taken out of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Illnesses, the DSM. The DSM-3. So to be labeled a feminist was erroneously to be equated with being a lesbian, and therefore erroneously equated to being mentally ill. And so you can see how it was working in the 60s, and I'm hoping that you're beginning to see some of the same kind of vitriolic arguments going on in 2023. The other image I want to call your attention to is the one in the bottom left-hand corner, Rosie the Riveter. Rosie the Riveter was a propaganda ad from World War II, which encouraged women to get out of the home and help with the war effort. They were all encouraged to sign up for the war effort, get out of the home, don't be a housewife, work in the factories. And they did that until, 1945, when the men came home, and then they were told, go back into your homes, go back and settle for what you were doing before. And of course, all that came to a head, and the second wave of feminism in the 1960s was largely due to the pushback when women were given a sense of freedom, and then that was taken away from them. I call your attention to Rosie the Riveter here because when we get to the third wave of feminism, which is from the 1990s, some say to the present, some say to about 2010 or thereabouts, we see Rosie again, but with many new variations on the theme. In the bottom left, again, we see we can all do it. Women of all different colors and nationalities and religions working together. We also see, finally, the idea coming that if men don't join the feminist movement, only half the population is joining the feminist movement. And we've already seen historically that there were feminist men. Thomas Paine was a feminist man. Aaron Burr was a feminist man. Aaron Burr had one daughter who he wanted educated, and he wanted her to be educated more than himself. He was a staunch supporter and admirer of Mary Wollstonecraft and commissioned the only known portrait of her. And the reason that he admired her was because of her outspoken stance on women being educated and being independent. Back to the third wave here. The third wave of feminism, building on the first and second wave, emphasized inclusivity. The word intersectionality started to come into use during this third wave. And the question of gender norms, gender performativity, was an idea that was introduced in the 1990s with Judith Butler. The questioning of why are there only two genders and two sexes, and why are those assumed to be equated? Why is masculinity assumed to be equated with maleness? Why is femininity assumed to be equated with femaleness? It doesn't make logical sense, nor does it make statistical sense that 7 billion with a B of anything can be neatly divided into two and only two categories. That is statistically an impossibility. So, with all of these different logical arguments going around, the third wave of feminism brought more diversity. It tried very hard to cure some of the racist blindness that the second wave of feminism had, and it's still going on. I mean, the conflicts between race and gender, the feminists, the white feminists and the black feminists are still working it out. But the third wave of feminism at least brought the idea of privilege into the conversation. And the road is still bumpy. It's still a rocky road, but at least there is a bit of awareness about how the intersection of race and gender, of privilege and feminism, which is actually an interesting intersection, work together and against each other. You see in this picture Gloria Steinem in the third wave. She's still around. Gloria is she's going strong. Here she is in the 1960s. Here she is in 2017 or something like that. But you can also notice that the fight in the third wave about abortion and autonomy on all levels is still a fight, and it's not just about bodily autonomy. It's about economics. It's about privilege. It's certainly about politics. And one of the things that I posted in the introductory material to our course is that if you do not think that the political is personal and the personal is political, then the way that you're seeing this discipline is missing something. And I'll be asking you several times throughout the semester, do you still think that the personal and the political are not intersectional? And I'm hoping that those of you who think so will be able to articulate that, and those of you who think that the political and the personal are separate need to also be able to have a voice and to express what you're seeing and what you're thinking. So the fourth wave of feminism is happening now. Some people say it started in the 2000s with the Y2K problem. I don't think that that's actually true. It started probably in the 2010s when the internet really took hold. I mean, the internet started as a public and usual part of life in the early 2000s, but by 2010, things were happening on the internet that made this the fact that sexism and racism and genderism still exist, very, very obvious. It equalized certain things, and it emphasized the divides in other ways. So some of the parts of the feminist movement in the fourth wave include online activism. The Me Too movement that started in 2016, it actually started in 2007, but it took hold of the national imagination with the 2016 election. LGBTQ plus rights and inclusion, because of the prevalence of information and misinformation, a lot is going on, and it's an interesting time to be studying women's and gender issues. In conclusion, feminist movement continues to evolve, and the call to action is again a political thing. You can't really avoid it. You can be a feminist alone, but who cares? When you're alone, equality is all or nothing. But you're not alone. You're in a classroom, even though it's asynchronous, and you're not seeing people necessarily face to face. The discussions that you engage in here, the awareness that you promote, and the collective learning, which is a necessary part of the feminist agenda, is something that we are going to try very hard to promote here. I'm going to do my best to get you excited about continuing the feminist process in your own lives and educating the people around you. And I'm going to just end with a few images that I found as I was making the slide presentation for the importance of continued advocacy. I will make this slide presentation available to you. The recording is obviously available to you, and I look forward to our discussion.